This story is so crazy that it deserves its own video. When I was younger, I had an enormous crush on this famous male YouTube star who I'll keep nameless. By the end of the story, let me know in the comments if you were able to guess who it was. At the time this story took place, I was a teenager and the YouTube star was just a few years older than me. He started out his career as a vlogger but was in the process of trying to launch a music career. Because he was already popular on YouTube and social media, he had lots of fans of his music as well, and thousands of people would pay lots of money for tickets to come out to his concerts. It's important to the story to note that my dad is a big name producer who is involved in some major record deals. I had been begging my dad for years to try and use his connections from work to get me in touch with this YouTuber, but nothing ever came through because he wasn't really in the same social circles as this person. But then one day, I was scrolling through Instagram when I noticed that I had received a message. I clicked on it and was shocked to see that the person had the checkmark symbol next to their username, signifying that they were verified. I read the message and discovered that it was from the assistant of the YouTuber I was crushing on. She told me that he was going to be having a concert in the area local to me the following week. The YouTuber had heard I was a fan and wanted to meet me backstage after the concert. He was even going to arrange for me to get a special box seat near the front of the stage. Of course, I was thrilled. I told my dad and he arranged for me to be driven to and from the concert since he and my mom would be working that day. I wanted to ask one of my friends to come with me, but with security and everything, I wasn't sure if this would be allowed. So I planned on going alone. When the day finally came, I picked out the perfect outfit and spent way too much time on my makeup and hair. One of my dad's employees picked me up and drove me to the theater where the concert was being held. I was super nervous, but incredibly excited as well. When I got there, a member of the YouTuber's team greeted me at the gate and guided me past security and straight to my box seat. It was an incredibly fancy spot with a perfect view of the stage. I was treated to lots of snacks and whatever drinks I wanted. The staff basically treated me like a queen, checking in frequently to see if there was anything else I needed. The theater was packed, and I was grateful that I probably had one of the best seats in the house. I felt sorry for all the people having to stand in the back squished together while I was sprawled out on a comfortable couch in a private room. I loved every minute of the concert, and it felt like a dream come true. Before long, he performed his last song, thanked the crowd, and waved goodbye as he walked off stage. My crush on the YouTube star had grown even greater than I thought was possible, and my heart was pounding as I realized I was going to be meeting him in real life in a matter of minutes. There was a gentle knock at the door, and the assistant who had reached out to me before poked her head into the room. She told me that the YouTuber was just signing some autographs and would be coming to meet with me shortly. I thanked her and she smiled at me before shutting the door and heading on her way. I began pacing around the room nervously as I tried to think of what I was going to say to him when he walked into the room. I wondered how I should greet him, not wanting to come off as a starstruck fan or embarrass myself. I checked out my appearance through the camera on my phone to make sure my hair was in place and that I looked my absolute best. I was interrupted by a quick knock on the door, and I quickly stuffed my phone in my pocket. I turned around and watched in amazement as the YouTuber strolled into the room. He was sweaty from all the jumping around he did during the performance, but he still looked as handsome as ever. This was the closest I had ever been to him, and I was in amazement as I took in his slicked back hair and the tattoos on his chest that were visible through his half unbuttoned shirt. He quickly crossed the room towards me and pulled me into a friendly hug. He said hello to me, and it felt super weird but exciting to hear my name come out of his mouth. Then he guided me over to the couch and we sat down. When he put his arm around me, I thought my heart was going to beat out of my chest. We started out with some small chat, and he asked me how I liked the concert and which songs had been my favorite. As much as I had planned to play things cool, I couldn't help but gush on and on about how big of a fan I was and how I'd been watching his videos since the very beginning. He didn't seem weirded out by my obvious, embarrassing crush on him, but instead thanked me for my support. At least 10 minutes had passed by, and I was surprised he was still hanging out with me. I was sure he was a busy person with a lot of things to do, but he didn't seem at all in a hurry to go anywhere. He told me that because I was such a loyal fan, he wanted to hook me up with some special merch of his that hadn't been released yet. He then called his assistant asking for the stuff to be brought to the room. A few minutes passed by and a box stuffed full of items was delivered to the room. Inside was nearly every merch item you could think of, including sweatshirts, t-shirts, sweatpants, and even his signature cologne. I was over the moon and jumped up to hug him. He chuckled at my reaction, telling me that I deserved all of it. He then stood up and walked over to the cabinet that was on the other side of the room. He opened it and pulled out a fancy-looking bottle of liqueur and 2 glasses. He asked me if I had ever drank alcohol before, and I shook my head, telling him I wasn't old enough to drink. He grinned at me, telling me we could keep it a secret. up between just the two of us. I didn't want to seem like a goody-goody in front of him, so when he handed me a glass of liquor, I accepted it. We clinked our glasses together and I took a sip. I grimaced, the liquid burning in my throat. We then began talking about music and his plans for where he was hoping to take his career moving forward. It was clear he was passionate about his work and was desperate to become the next greatest artist. To my surprise, he brought up my dad and began naming some well-known record deals he had been a part of. My dad is fairly well-known in the music industry, but I had never expected this YouTuber to be someone who was familiar with his work. But it was clear he had followed my dad's recent projects closely. He then began mentioning how, with the help of my dad, he could jumpstart his career. I began to feel slightly uncomfortable as I realized what sort of direction this conversation was taking. He asked if I could call my dad right now and tell him all about what a great performance I had just witnessed, and how I thought this YouTuber was the next big thing that everyone he worked with should know about. I told him that there were a lot of elements that went into a record deal, and it wasn't as if my dad would be able to just sign him up over the phone. But it was like he didn't understand me. He started to get pushy and suggested that, after all, he had set me up with this private room and all this merch, and this was just a little favor that he was asking for in return. I got the feeling that I was being used and saw a whole different side of this guy that I didn't like. He was so charming, but he seemed to use this charm to his advantage, and it was very manipulative. I stood up and told him that it was getting late and that my parents were going to get worried if I didn't get home soon. At this point, he got angry and began yelling at me, telling me that I was ungrateful and spoiled and that he couldn't believe how stubborn I was being. Tears filling my eyes, I told him that I would tell my dad about him as soon as I got home and would do my best to set up a meeting between them. This wasn't good enough for this guy. He wanted a deal and he wanted it now. I began making my way to the door, but he stood in front of me, blocking my way to the exit. My heart began beating even faster, and I got the feeling that I was trapped. "You're not leaving here until you get me signed," he told me, crossing his arms against his chest. I knew that trying to explain things to him anymore was going to be pointless, so I remained silent and stared at the floor, trying to think of how to escape. Just then, there was a knock at the door. It was his assistant. She said that my driver had arrived and was waiting for me. Without hesitation, I silently followed her and she led me out to my driver. I thanked her for the experience before getting into the car. I cried the whole way home, but told nobody of my experience. I was just too embarrassed. Sometimes the people you admire are nothing like how they...
Susan had never been to Portugal in her 20 years of human existence. But when the opportunity for an all-expenses-paid studying abroad program came to her, she jumped on it like a starving octopus on a shrimp. She had never been outside the United States at all, in fact. The only bit of outside culture she had received was from the occasional message on Facebook from acquaintances from Spain and Africa, whom she rarely talked to. Needless to say, she was ecstatic to finally use some of her 2 courses in Portuguese to her educational advantage. 0 meters. Crest of the waves. Her arrival into the Aveiro airport wasn't anything very special. The people didn't speak much besides her few classmates, and she spent most of her time on her smartphone, trying to cram any bit of common Portuguese she forgot back into her forgetful mind. The apartment building they were sent to was particularly homely, with wood stained from hundreds of years of fish guts and fiesta-goer fluids, carpets made from what seemed to be fresh sheep flesh, and wallpaper that curled at every corner, revealing the Elmer's glue haphazardly slathered behind it. It smelled of feces from unspecified creatures that they'd all assumed ran through the walls and emerged at night to present more of their waste for passing tenants to experience. 1.5 meters. Susan felt like it was just disgusting and flawed enough to remind her of home. It was humbling to find that they were not working to impress you on their looks, but rather how they treated the guests. The landlady approached the lot of college kids and welcomed them in both English and Portuguese, showing them to their rooms and telling them about the history as courteously as she could, given her slightly flawed English. 3 meters. Shallow fish. The tenants all waved and gave sincere smiles and welcomed the group. Susan felt no animosity to her American heritage or her pale white skin. She just felt like she was coming into a neighborhood. She felt comfort on her first night. She unpacked her things with her roommate, picked out a bed she thought wouldn't feel the most like cardboard, did her nightly routine, and laid down to sleep for the first time in a new country. She felt sincerely happy. 4.5 meters. The first thing Susan heard when her consciousness broke the darkness was a sound of sharp cracking just beyond the room she was in. Her vision was blurred. Her ears rang with shell shock. The thuds from blood smashing into her temples made her cringe when the light smashed into her dizzy vision. She felt chains tightly wrapped around her wrists and ropes binding her legs to the pole behind her, the hard steel floor below on her completely bare skin, and slight rocking from side to side with the resonance of water from underneath her. She smelled nothing but blood. 6 meters. Pressure begins. She wondered if this was all her blood, as she was bleeding from several places on her body. She was naked, bound, and feeling nausea building as she felt blood trickling down her legs onto the steel floor. 7.5 meters. As she tried her best not to vomit at the realization that she had been kidnapped, violated, beaten, and brought onto some strange ship, the sight of the entrails inside a half-open cooler overcame her efforts. She vomited the contents of her stomach onto a combination of the floor and her own naked chest. She tried her best to hold strong and find a way out of this. 9 meters. Density. She panicked and began to struggle out of the restraints. The sound of Portuguese speakers from the door on the far side of the room resonated. She quieted herself to hear them say what she interpreted as, "Take off, skin, feed. Feed it to him. He's already hungry again." 10.5 meters. She couldn't imagine the horror of what was on the other side of the door, and she had no intention of being part of it. She noticed the chains wrapped tightly around her wrists were soaked with her vomit, and it began to loosen their grip on her. She stretched and contorted her hands, ripping the chains off her wrists. 12 meters. This was her chance to find some way out. She looked all around for something sharp to cut her restraints. She eyed a piece of splintered wood in the cooler of entrails she still had trouble glancing at. It looked like it fell off the shambling roof above from the rocking waves or general wear. As she ripped through the ropes, tying her legs to the steel pole, the feeling of the strange fluid from the organs that soaked into the wood made her stomach twist in pain. She could feel her insides squirm with disgust, but she fought her hardest to maintain and act fast. 13.5 meters. The waves around the ship began to rock more and more violently, like something was intentionally smashing into the hull, or a large rock from below threw off the balance. She tumbled into the wall beside the cooler and couldn't help but emit a whine as she felt a crack in her right side after slamming into the hard wood and metal. She scrambled as best she could to her feet, given the rocking, the fluids on the floor, and her own injuries. 15 meters. Compression. Footsteps were heard, along with angry Portuguese heading right for the door leading to where she had been tied up. She frantically looked for anywhere to hide, but only saw a large cooler as something she could conceal herself in. She dreaded the idea subconsciously, but she was in survival mode at that point. She climbed into the bloody, slimy sludge and moved the container lid over her and the pile of entrails. 16.5 meters. She stopped breathing. She gazed out of the crack she left between the container lid and the cooler, and she saw one of the men that greeted her and her friends to the apartment building burst into the room, cursing loudly in Portuguese and examining the pole she had been strapped to. She felt a sense of contempt that she couldn't quite describe while looking at the familiar face, but something too peculiar to be ignored caught her eye in the now partially open door he came through. A gigantic reptilian arm craned over the top of the deck, grabbing a piece of bloody meat off the table and pulling it hastily into the water. 18 meters. She put her bloody, sludge-covered hand to her mouth to keep her from gasping in shock, but only let out a retch and coughs in response to the taste on her lips and the smell seeping into her nostrils. The man turned and grabbed the top of the cooler, knowing where she was. She sprang from the gory mess, wielding the sharp, splintering wood she cut her restraints with, and grappled the man. The slices of wood on his flesh and the shock in his now blood-covered face did nothing to Susan. She kept slashing away at his throat and chest. She stared down at the dying man and shoved the wooden weapon down his throat. He gagged and quickly bled out onto the floor and Susan's hands. She did not speak. She did not make any more noise besides a small whisper into his ear before he lost consciousness. 20.5 meters. Sinking. She grabbed his body and pulled it as best she could out of sight before anyone noticed, but she realized it was too late. The stabbing, gurgling, and slamming onto the floor was already alerting whoever else was on the ship. She saw a man and woman beginning to brandish pistols. The woman she recognized as the landlord that was supposedly a part of the study abroad program. Susan ran up to the door and slammed it shut before they could rush inside. She put the body and chair up against the door to try and buy time. That's when she heard shots fired and felt hot metal pass through her right shoulder and left hand. She screamed in anguish and fell to the floor. She had forgotten that the walls were wooden and thin. 20 meters. She began to cry, thinking of the last time she saw her parents and how she didn't spend time with them. She thought of all the friends she left at home and would never see again. She thought of all the good things she forgot she could accomplish. A bullet then passed through her hip. She thought of all the times she wondered what hell would be like. She wept and held on to the man she had stabbed to death. She asked him in a desperate attempt to hear anyone talk to him ever again. Then a sound rang through the ship. It wasn't more gunfire. It wasn't more Portuguese curse words. It was a bellowing hiss. It was like a sound a Komodo dragon makes when it feels challenged, but as loud and deep as a humpback whale bellow. The bullets stopped flying. 23.5 meters. Susan heard screams from outside the door. The bullet holes shone the sun rays through the wall. She saw glimpses of that same arm smash onto the deck through the holes. She heard the violent screams of the landlady as it smashed her several times onto the deck, leaving splintered wood and blood covering the outside. The man accompanying her attempted to reload the spent pistol, but he shook too much from the ship's rocking. The shock of his partner being bludgeoned to death by a beast many times his size, and his clip slid across the deck and into the open water. He frantically approached the door and clawed at it, smashed into it, and pleaded to Susan on the other side, witnessing the horror. 25 meters. Death. She wrapped her arm and waist in the dead man's jacket in order to control her bleeding, and she laid on the floor, knowing her consciousness was fading. When the beast grabbed the man with both its reptilian arms and tore him in half, she smiled. She didn't hear any more noise from anyone on board. She was alone. She passed out. 27.5 meters. Several hours later, Susan awoke to the rocking of the ship below, the rotten smell of the familiar body parts she had stowed herself away in, and the vomit staining the floor. She moved the chair and the corpse from the hole-ridden door, pushed it open, and walked as best she could to the steering wheel of the mid-sized fishing vessel. She was alone. She began to steer the ship back to any shore she could find when the bellowing hiss rang out again behind her. 29 meters. She knew if she did not calm the beast, it would bash her brains in and eat her the same way it ate the crew. She ran as best she could inside the room she first awoke in, grabbed the cooler of guts and the corpse of the man she murdered and dumped it into the water below. She watched carefully to see if this would quiet the beast below when it rose up from the depths of the lake. 30.5 meters. Life below. It was gargantuan. The head had two large amphibious eyes that were positioned on each side of its head, which resembled an anaconda in shape. It was bipedal as far as she could see, with two enormous arms whose bulky claws grasped the side of the ship. It looked at her from eye level as it hoisted itself up onto the railing of the ship. She almost felt like the creature wanted to observe her. She knelt down in front of its gigantic face, and it released a frog-like tongue down into the water and grasped a few of the organs she poured into the lake. It chewed them with what seemed like hundreds of razor-sharp, foot-long teeth that ripped the organs and smashed them down its throat. It made a humming noise, licked its chops, cocked its head to show her its eye that was as big as her head, and it dove back into the water. 32 meters. Even though it stank of death, mulch, and algae, Susan didn't feel fear or disgust. She felt a sense of excitement and wonder that she had never experienced before. She almost didn't want to leave the fascinating creature, The thought actually made her laugh with a mix of lunacy and surprise that she could even feel anything after her experience. She kept giggling to herself as she steered the boat back onto the shore. 33.5 meters. Susan had survived. She was naked, covered in humid bodily fluids, having committed murder and fed the most terrifying creature she had ever witnessed, and she giggled as she wandered back into the city. She giggled at the police station when she was arrested and questioned about her experience. She kept giggling when she found out how close she was to having her skin tore off, her organs harvested, her carcass fed to a salamander, and her remains sold for millions of dollars on the black market. 35 meters. She kept giggling when she realized the organs in the cooler were from her missing classmates. She kept giggling on the plane ride back to her home in the United States. She kept giggling when she changed her major in college to marine biology. 40 meters. Lake bed.